So welcome, welcome everyone to the 7th monthly Motivational Monday of the season. Tonight's discussion will be focused on methodological trends in educational psychology research. My name is Hye Rin Lee, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine. Motivation Monday is hosted by the Graduate Student Committee of AERA's Motivation and Education SIG. We offer this programming as a way to disseminate and share ideas and strategies for conducting educational research. This year, Motivation Monday is a little bit different than our previous years. They are live. So our wonderful graduate student leadership team has organized a series of synchronous panels and discussions each month, and special thanks to Yen, Corey, Maggie, Preeti, and the whole graduate student community. So make sure to keep coming back. Before we get started, I want to take time to acknowledge that this month we're celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islanders Heritage Month, honoring sacrifices and the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across all domains. The GSC recognizes, appreciates, and applauds all of the AAPI scholars who have contributed and continue to contribute to educational research. We remember Alice Fong Yu, first Asian teacher of a major public school in California, and we will link in the chat for more information if you want to read more about this. And now we would like to introduce our panelists to you all. Thank you very, very much for coming and talking to us today. We have 4 amazing scholars here to discuss trending methodologies and educational research. Dr. Jessica DeCuir-Gunby is the head of the Department of Teacher Education and Learning Sciences and a professor of educational psychology at North Carolina State University. Her program of research focuses on 3 areas. 1, race and racial identity, including critical race theory. 2, research methods with an emphasis on mixed methods. And 3, emotions in education. Dr. DeCuir-Gunby serves on the editorial board for Contemporary Educational Psychology, Educational Psychologists, an American Educational Research Journal. She has also published in many journal outlets such as Contemporary Educational Psychology, Educational Psychologist, Educational Researcher, and Reviewer of Educational Research. In the fall, Dr. DeCuir-Gunby will be joining the Rossler School of Education at the University of Southern California as a professor of educational psychology. We will also link in the chat Dr. DeCuir's recent publication using critical race methods mixed methodology to explore the experiences of African Americans in education relevant to the topic tonight. Dr. Revathy Kumar is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. Her research interests focus on social and cultural processes involved in constructing a sense of self and identity across adolescents and young adults in culturally diverse societies. Dr. Kumar is a Fulbright Specialist Scholar, Fellow of the American Psychological Association, commencing in January of 2021, Provost Faculty Fellow for the academic years of 2018 through 2020, and recipient of the 2001 University Outstanding Faculty Research and Scholarship Award. She has published in many journal outlets such as the American Educational Research Journal, Educational Psychologist, Journal of Educational Psychology, Journal of Research on Adolescence, and Educational Studies. We will also link in the chat Dr. Kumar's recent publication, Culturally Inclusive and Responsive Curricular Learning Environments, also called Circles, an Exploratory Sequential Mixed Methods Approach, relevant to the topic tonight. Dr. Doug Lombardi is an associate professor in the Human Development and Quantitative Methodology Department of the University of Maryland. As the head of the Science Learning Research Group, he conducts research examining scientific reasoning and thinking about knowledge claims. Much of this research is situated within the context of formal classroom settings and focuses on effective teaching tools and strategies to support deep learning and understanding, particularly about topics that pose local, regional, and global challenges, for example, causes of current climate change, availability of freshwater resources, weaponized information. Dr. Lombardi has received early career research awards from the American Educational Research Association's Division C, American Psychological Association's Division 15, NARST, a worldwide organization for improving science, teaching, and learning through research, and the Society for Text and Discourse. He has published in many journal outlets such as the Psychological Science and the Public Interest, Educational Psychologist, Contemporary Educational Psychology, and the Journal for Research and Science Teaching. He is an associate editor for the Contemporary Educational Psychology and the Journal for Research and Science Teaching. We will link in the chat Dr. Lombardi's recent publication, The Curious Construct of Active Learning, relevant to the topic tonight. Dr. Gwen Marchand is an Associate Dean of Research and Sponsored Projects and Professor of Educational Psychology and Higher Education at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her research interests focus on academic motivation and engagement, classroom systems, student mobility, collaborative team processes, and research and evaluation. Dr. Marchand is a co-editor of 2 methods-focused special issues, including one on mixed methods for contemporary educational psychology and one on complex systems approaches to educational research in the Journal of Experimental Education. She has also published in many journal outlets such as Educational Psychologist, the Journal of Educational Psychology, and Contemporary Educational Psychology. We will link in the chat Dr. Marchand's recent publication, Multi-Level Mixed Methods Research and Educational Psychology, relevant to the topics tonight. So a huge thank you to our panelists today. Our discussion will include 3 sections. First, we'll have a discussion with our panelists. Second, we'll have a chance to have the audience questions answered. And lastly, we'll have a collective and interactive activity on implementing methodologies in educational psychological research. So our discussion today will begin with understanding key methodological trends in educational psychology research, and then we'll lead into specific strategies and approaches related to implementing those methodologies in research. And so we'll start with our first question of the day is, in your own work, how do you decide which methods to use? And perhaps we can start with Dr. DeCuir-Gunby.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm so excited to be here today to talk about methodology and be here with these wonderful panelists. I really enjoy talking about methodology because we really can't have a good research study unless we have really good methods. So in terms of how I decide what methods to use, I'm kind of old school in terms of I focus on what is it that I want to know. I go into like, what is it I want to study? What does I want to know? And once I kind of map out what is it I want to know, I think about, well, what methods are best to answer those questions. And I'm a mixed methods person, so I feel comfortable in any kind of arena in which I'm in. So whether it's the quantitative arena, the qualitative arena, or definitely mixed methods arena, I'm comfortable in any way. And so I go with those questions. And because my worldview is a critical one, I tend to ask kind of those critical questions. I want to know about people's experiences. I want to know about people's kind of issues of power, or what's happening in those contexts. So chances are I'm almost always going to have some question that deals with trying to understand people's experiences, their perceptions of something. So chances are I'm going to have some kind of qualitative question, not necessarily, but most likely will have some kind of question that's best answered from some kind of qualitative perspective. But I always start off from what is it that I want to know, and then that's how I get to the methods that I'm going to use.
Thank you for that response. Anyone else can feel free to contribute to this question.
I could not agree more. I start in the same place. I think as I move from what do I really want to know and what's the best research design and methodological choice to answer those questions, I also consider similarly what's available to me. So there's a pragmatic lens that I tend to apply to my my research methods. I think I see some of my wonderful mentors on this call, Doctors Kinderman and Skinner, and they, you know, I learned some really important things from them around how to engage in research. And I think Ellen used to say, build the Cadillac. And if you didn't say this, Ellen, I apologize for attributing this to you, but, you know, kind of design the Cadillac, which would now probably be like, what, a Tesla or something like that. But and then what do you need to start? What's the foundational piece of knowledge that you need to develop in order to be able to move forward? So I think there's a pragmatic lens. And then I do a lot of partnership engaged research. So similar to what Jessica was saying, you know, I think about how my research is going to develop in partnership with the needs of the individuals that I'm working with. And so a lot of times there's a compromise as well in terms of how to shift and address, you know, how can I answer the questions I want to know, but also answer the questions that are important and relevant to my partners, and give them information that's actionable and useful for their world.
So I just want to add, I agree with everything that Drs. Gunby and Marchand said, but I also wanted to add another aspect to this, and that is, yes, when we don't know it is important to do mixed methods, I think, and it's particularly important to do that. Also, when we don't know much about the population that we are studying and how they interpret their experiences that might be different. And so in my own work, for example, when I was started working with Arab American adolescents, I really needed to understand what they experience, how they define. There's so many stereotypes associated with the groups, and so how do they understand agency? How do they understand schooling? And so it really it was important for me to first start out with really talking to students and talking to students of different groups and seeing how they experience school, for example, and then that helped me I built on that to then maybe do some quantitative work. And so I think that is an important consideration as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I share similarities to the other three panelists. Recently, though, we've been, and this goes along with what Dr. Marchand was saying, that you know, we involve a lot of partners and stakeholders in the research that we do. So a lot of the questions that we've been interested in thinking about that primarily drive our methods to some degree have been coming from them. So it's much more of a collaborative and iterative process. And also lately, what we've been doing as a team with these data that we have, particularly in light of all the world events that have been going on, is kind of look at the data and see what emergent themes are coming up. So it's been more emergent than you know, saying, hey, this is the research question and applies these particular methods, and sometimes we have to kind of go outside our particular theoretical perspective and think about these other worldviews that are involved. And so we've been much more open in how we approach things, and it's really resulted in some really interesting methods that we've been trying to apply, and it's really pushed us kind of to think about things a little bit differently.
Thank you for this. I really like how, we were talking about having this more holistic approach and talking with our community partners about some of the questions that they're interested in, as well as, really having these sorts of conversations before really taking on the next step for these research questions. The next question that we have is, what statistical or analytic programs do you use the most and why?
Do you want us to go back in the same order, or does it matter?
Sure, it doesn't matter whoever wants to go.
Well, I'm gonna give you kind of a general response to that one. I like to use programs that my students understand and know how to use, because I think, when we're working with students and we're helping them to understand things conceptually, and we're teaching them to go collect data and doing all of these different things in terms of our research setting, I don't want students to get caught up in having a difficult time trying to understand the research program. So I like to pick programs that students understand how to use. My college, for some reason, decided they wanted to teach statistics using Stata. I have no idea why they use Stata. Students get, statistics, is anxiety producing for a lot of students, and they just get so overwhelmed with learning statistics conceptually and then having to learn how to use data. But then when I work with them in my lab, I'm like, okay, we're just going to use SPSS. And then they run the same analysis, like, oh, it's so much easier. And they understand it, and they understand how to run these, understand the statistical analyses, and it clicks and makes more sense to them. So I don't want to make things unnecessarily complicated for students. And so I use the statistical packages that, I guess require the least amount of resistance, basically, for my students. But then also for qualitative, for instance, I really like personally using, for instance, Atlas TI. I mean, that worked really well for me, but it didn't work very well working in a team, because the license was very expensive, and then it made it really difficult to kind of work in teams, because we had to figure out who was coding what and when. And so it worked better to have a web-based type program, so we could kind of code at different times or at the same time and keep up with the data. So I found that Deduce ended up being very helpful, and they have a lot of online resources and a lot of online, they do a lot of webinars. And so they found it very helpful for group-based coding. So I like to do things that I think could be helpful and easy for a team, but also allow us to be that's practical, that we can kind of keep up with our data, and that people could kind of access the resources at any given time, wherever they are in the world, because we do a lot of things virtually. I think COVID-19 kind of showed us that we have to be flexible, and that we have to be able to collect data and analyze data, in various parts of the country, sometimes the world. And I think, using web-based tools, I think is a little kind of the way to go, at least for me in some of my research, especially since I'm moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. And some, I'm still going to be working with some students at NC State. I need to be flexible with the kind of tools I'm using, because, I can't necessarily have something that has to be place-based. I have to have something that is going to be web-based. So I like to have stuff that students can use, that they know how to use, that they don't get overwhelmed by, and stuff that we can use that's web-based.
So I do agree with Dr. DeCuir-Gunby, that the software that is easily available for students, that is important. And we do have SPSS, and and students can access it. But in terms of what analytical and statistical programs that I have used a lot for quantitative, I was working for quite some time, till about 2014. I was also working at the Institute for Social Research, and working with really large data sets with over 200. They would get, it was Monitoring the Future. You may have heard of that. And so I ended up doing a lot of hierarchical linear modeling and structural equation modeling. But then when I started my own own projects and work, where I was working with different cultural groups, I think I'm really drawn to qualitative methods. I'm really drawn to having conversations with students, and the software that I have been using for quite a while now is NVivo, and I find that I find it very intuitive and helpful, and it's also, I find that it is much easier to use than Atlas TI, for example. So I've sort of just used NVivo for the longest time now. So those are some of the softwares I use. But I do think nowadays there are so many that are available for free, like R and so on. I don't know how to use R, but it certainly is there, and it's and I am told that it is very easy. I think it makes sense to go with things that are more reasonably priced, because they do just as good a job, I guess.
So I'll jump in. I'm looking at Doug. Doug's looking at me. So I would agree with all of that. I have a tendency to want to work with whatever my postdocs and my graduate students feel comfortable working with right now. From an analytics standpoint, we use R, which has been a shift for me for quite a bit. I still go to M+ for things like structural equation models and latent profile analyses and things, but I have a really great postdoc, David McKinney, who does a lot of work in R, and so I'm slowly learning some of those analyses. We also use, I do for some of the complexity related work that I work on with John Hilpert. We use state space grids quite a bit, and there's Mangold, Tom Hollenstein has a program that we use for that. And also some for network analyses, we use R as well, but there's some really nice, there's a bunch of packages in R for network analyses that are really great. And for visualization of those, I think of visualization tools also as an analytic tool. So not just running stats or coding qualitative data, but also thinking about how to visualize that for interpretation reasons. And so we use Gephi sometimes for network analyses, but there's constant, I mean, it's so hard to keep up with all the packages that show up in R. So there's so much there. And then we also, I know I don't use these, but I know that, again, for like really dense time series analyses and like click data and stuff like that, there's a variety of packages too that are not my areas of expertise, but certainly on the projects we work on, those packages exist in R and some other spaces as well. So I think qualitatively, why we've used Max QDA for some mixed methods work, which is something that has been really interesting to work with. And I have a hard time with Atlas TI for whatever reason. It just doesn't make as much sense to me. So I use NVivo for qualitative too.
Yeah, right on. We've used all those, every single one. I think just about. That's not exactly true, but I think the thing to remember here is I'm not sure which of you said it, is that you can get a lot of stuff for free or cheap. That's good. And R is free, for example. It does have a steep learning curve, I think. But once you get it, you're rolling, especially if you've had some coding experience. But if you want something cheap and easy that looks like SPSS, but it's really good, is JASP. I would get that. It's free. You can get it. You can run it. Bada bing, bada boom. We've used Gephi. We use an interesting structural equation modeling tool called Warp PLS. We use partial least squares method, and a lot of the stuff that we do is just because of the nature of our samples and the nature of the kind of questions we ask. We'll use a lot of categorical methods. So I had some great teachers at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and they taught me a lot of different including Dr. Marchand. They taught me a lot of different methods and methodologies. I never, fortunately, got to take a class with her, but we just kind of just jump in and figure out whatever we need when we need it. So, and students are great with helping with that.
Thank you for sharing all of your recommendations. There's just so many, it seems like there's just so many different statistical softwares for both quantitative and qualitative data analysis. And it really seems like accessibility is a very important thing to have, especially for us graduate students, as well as just learning so many different types of things that might be accessible for us, especially during this time period with COVID and the pandemic, moving everything to the web-based systems, so especially for collaborations and so forth. The next question, moving kind of into different gears, within the field, there seems to be a dissonance between focusing on the uniqueness of specific learning contexts and the generalizability of research findings. How do you navigate this issue in your work?
I'll go first. Context really matters. And that's the message I've been saying for recently. Context really matters. It's really important. Context is really important. So we've been grappling with this very question. We're contextual based on our classroom context, but we want to see our students take the skills that they learn in the classroom with these tools we develop and take them outside the classroom, because we want to develop a more informed citizenry. So we've been kind of thinking about how do we think about where context is so important in a classroom context, how does that transfer out? And frankly, we've been getting some difficulties with it, although we have some recent results that are pretty good. So context is really important. Topic is really important. This Curious Construct of Active Learning paper that you've all included, you might want to take a look at that, and it kind of thinks about how to go from the more specific to the generalizable. But I'm a little bit uncertain about generalizability, frankly, given the kind of research that we do.
So we'll go backwards. I agree. I actually, anytime anyone wants to talk about this, please look me up. I happily chat for a long time on this one. But I guess that tension that exists is something that I think is somewhat false. And I say that because I think what we focus on in our analyses, or what I try to look at, is patterns and understanding the way that our context and environment influence what's possible for the expression of our different patterns in our data and in the phenomena that we're interested in. And so I'm less concerned about finding a specific finding that I want to apply to other people, and more concerned about thinking around the nuance of what are the patterns that we're seeing in our data, and how are they afforded or constrained by the contextual the contextual elements in which they're unfolding and emerging. So I think we try to, there's certain conditions that are repeatable. This is, for those of you that think about state spaces and those types of possibilities, right? So we have conditions, and we have all the possible places where you might have combinations of variables or people that may show up many, many times and may be very rare conditions. And I think the way I think about the generalizability issue is, how often do these patterns repeat? Do they repeat differently depending on the social and political and direct environmental conditions under which they are unfolding, and then what's the range of possibilities. So it's very unlikely we're going to end up in one state, or more likely we're going to end up in another, and then how do our factors, our people, or individual characteristics combine to get us back to similar states over and over and over again that might be adaptable or desirable for individual development and the environment, the contextual development. But it's kind of a very long-winded way of saying that I think in the kinds of work that I do anyway, I'm not worried. It's a tension, but I think that I'm more concerned about trying to find an authentic representation and story and message around those patterns that we find, so that, and conveying those in a way that's transparent so that it's useful for my reader.
So I'm going to respond to this in based on the work that I've done. And since you specifically mentioned circles, I will draw on that as well, that article in Contemporary at Psych. But in terms of actually experiencing dissonance, there seems to be, you said, a dissonance focusing on uniqueness and generalizability. I don't see that as a dissonance at all. I think it's just recognizing that contexts matter, contexts make a difference. And in fact, I found that students experience, let me give you a specific example. So how do students from different groups experience the learning context? Now, if you in schools where they are a numerical majority, where they are a numerical minority, for example, how do they experience it? And I could really see the difference that contexts make. So, for example, when I went into a school that was primarily Arab, I had students. It was interesting. There, they talk about groups. Students group themselves no matter where. And so there were Lebanese, and then there were Iraqi, and then there were Lebanese, Iraqi, and Yemeni students. And the way they talked about themselves in the context and their sense of belonging and so forth was amazing. They really felt a part of the school. I went to schools where whites were a minority, and whites, and across all these schools, there was a lot of variation. And it was interesting to see. One white student I interviewed actually said, that I wish they would treat me more like an Arab. And I was so surprised by that response, because you seldom hear these things. And then when you go into schools where it was really culturally diverse, there were, whites were a majority, you could see how the groups interacted and their relationships with the teacher. Everything was informed by the nature of the context in which these students were in. So there were unique experiences based on the context. And at the same time, I was across all these groups. We conducted a lot of focus group interviews with whites, with Black students and Arab students. And what I found was that there are some aspects of the environment, regardless of the learning context, regardless of the differences, they viewed certain aspects as being really crucial, as being important if they wanted to have an environment that is culturally responsive and relevant and supportive. And so across groups, I did find some commonalities. Now, would I say that that is generalizable across all populations? I'm not going that far, but certainly I was able to establish that there are certain aspects of the environment, and these items were based on the qualitative analysis I had done, prior to doing the quantitative. And I found that they were, for example, when they describe a learning environment that is more mastery focused, there was consensus among students from different groups that this is something that they value, and that was, and across different groups they valued. So I think contexts matter. There are certain aspects that are going to be unique to each group and their experiences within that context. And there are also going to be some shared commonalities across the groups.
When I think about generalizability, I think about the old, quantitative research is generalizable, qualitative research is not generalizable. And I just kind of question that, because if you think about a lot of the quantitative studies we see, many of them happen, the general psych pool, and so we need to ask ourselves, what's really generalizable about, students, psychology students are, undergraduate students, in the Midwest, or in my case, undergraduate students from the South. How is that generalizable to the whole rest of the country, or how's that to the world? Or is that just generalizable to the South? Or in the case for me, North Carolina, is it just generalizable to North Carolina? And so I just kind of question just the whole concept of quantitative methods being generalizable from that perspective. But then also question the fact that qualitative research is not generalizable. Yeah, I mean, if you look at individual study, maybe one study that looks at maybe 20 students or something, maybe that one study isn't generalizable. But when you look at a series of qualitative studies that have similar trends and similar findings across a variety of contexts, then you can kind of say, these trends are very similar. These trends are saying this is what happens. This is what happened in certain circumstances, certain contexts. And then we could say this phenomenon is occurring. And so then that kind of says these series of studies together show some sense of generalizability. So I just kind of question the whole notion of a study being generalizable. I kind of prefer saying that there is a bulk of studies that show trends and common trends, and I think that's what we should be looking at: common trends across similar contexts, showing that similar things are happening, and then we can kind of say, hey, we're seeing patterns, and from these patterns we can say, hey, this is kind of more definitive, if anything is definitive, but we can kind of say this is kind of what we think is happening based upon these series of studies. And that's the way I like to look at generalizability. But in terms of my particular research, I don't have any dissonance. I mean, I study my context. I study African-American students. I mean, whether or not, my African-American students, I study, whether their experiences are similar or different than other people. I don't know, but their experiences are important to me. So I study their experiences. And so I don't really worry about whether or not it's generalizable or not, because their experiences are important.
Thank you. I think this reiterates especially the importance of understanding the context for what you're studying and how you're studying these different questions. The next question that we have is, there's been an open, so what advice do you have for practicing open science, especially as it's becoming more prominent within the field?
I can't say I'm an expert in this, so I'm going to just say what I think and the rest. But I think some of the advice would be to understand that, particularly if you're intending to publish, what the publication expectations are for the journal outlet that you're interested in, or if you have some funding, be really clear on the extent to which your data, code, results, et cetera, should be available and at what level. And then think about how you are structuring your consent documents and your confidentiality documents to ensure that you can meet the demands of scientific transparency and open science with also sharing data in a way that is authentic to what you intend to do. Most of the time we're not being asked to share things that are identifiable, so it's not really a worry, but I think sometimes people get worried about that. So it's important to be really familiar with that. And then also from the publication side, which is a little bit less of what we're talking about, I think, in terms of this question around, sharing of data repositories and things of that nature. But for students in particular, check and see if your library is a fund to help you publish. If you want to publish something as an open source, is in an open source, and then also if there's what repository expectations are. But a lot of times, libraries and universities, if there's costs associated with that from a graduate student perspective, you can often get those defrayed by different sources at your university.
So I asked the question, what do you mean by open science? And so I saw data sharing and openness was an example, but many people hear different things when they hear the term open science. They hear, hey, this is the reproducibility crisis. They think open access, we have to make sure that everyone has access to all of our papers. They mean everybody has access to all of our data. So I find it's good to kind of clarify exactly what you mean, or the other thing is pre-registration, right? There may be more. So the question when you ask about open science is, what do you mean? And what exactly are you talking about? And what does it mean in a particular setting and context and a particular situation? And what we do is complex and hard. It's a lot harder than any other science, I think, if we consider ourselves a science. I still think we're pre-paradigmatic, but let's not go on philosophy of science tonight. But we do stuff that's really, really hard. I mean, physicists have it easy to some degree. So I don't know.
I am not an expert on open science, and so I'm not going to answer that question directly, but that question raised another question for me that I wanted to throw, I just want to throw it out there because this was an experience I had immediately after AERA. So what are the things that can be when if you are sharing your research, if you're sharing your work, what is it okay for people to take photographs and then post it on Twitter? I don't know. And is it we started talking about publications. So let's say that that's part of a publication that's about to come out, and you've signed all these contracts saying, this, it's only here, but you've just presented something on that and it's out there. And I think in that sense, I'm not quite sure how all these things work. Well, it made me question, is it legal? Is it not legal? I don't have an answer, but it got me concerned. It certainly did, because I suddenly found that what I had written and done was out there on Twitter, and somebody emailed me about it. And that's when I said, where on earth did you find it? I don't go much on, on Twitter. And so then I went and tracked it down, and I found that, yes, you take a picture and post it. But that's not open science, I know, but it is the availability and of information, which how much do you share, how much do you not share, when is it right to share? I think these are all questions that really deserve more consideration.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on open science, but I am not, from what I undo my limited understanding of it, I am not in support of it. From my perspective, I study marginalized populations. I study African American African Americans, and I have to build a lot of rapport in order to do the research that I do and build a sense of trust. And it takes a lot to be able to get access to the communities and for them to tell me their stories. And so the idea, or to get access, having to take my to do my surveys, and then the idea that then I'm just going to go and make it open to anybody. Plus, I work too hard to get it. You know, it takes a lot to be able to collect a lot of information from a marginalized group, right? And to get a large sample size. And then I'm just not going to do all that hard work and then turn it over for somebody else, and then they can have easy access to it. That's not going to happen. So, so there's a lot of issues for me, and for the open science. So I understand, the whole replicability issue, and people are having issues with whether or not people falsifying data. I mean, so there's a lot of questions people have about data, and that's why they want the open science issue. But I think we also need to think about the people, the participants, and whether or not they feel comfortable with what they shared being open and for the world to see. Even if you change names and kind of stuff, some things some stories you can't change all that, and if they really knew that this is what you're going to do with that information, they wouldn't want to participate in your work. And then for the researcher who has to put forth all that effort in order to do that, to get that work, what reward do we get for having to put all that effort to get that to the communities, the rapport we have to build to get that data? And sometimes it takes years to be able to get inroads in communities, to be able to get that data. Then all of a sudden we just have to hand this stuff over. No, I'm just not in support of that, at least for the work that I do. I'm just thinking about Native American communities, Latinx communities, real poor communities. I mean, this is going to be a challenge for us, those of us that do work with marginalized communities, and it's just going to be too difficult.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. I think this is a really interesting conversation, and especially with the different, at least I've never thought about like how many, what different, what open science might consist of, because there's so many different parts and facets to what it is. The next question that we have is about learning methods. So our question is, what advice do you have for graduate students learning new methodologies?
Don't want to, okay. I don't know how others feel about this, but I tend to tell my students to take as many methods focused courses as they can. I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make is when we let our research questions be constrained and driven by the analyses we know, right? So, and I see that a lot. I see people say, well, I've asked this question because I know how to do this thing, or, so I feel like when you have a breadth of information around what's available and what's possible, it opens, you can ask, I see that people ask more interesting questions. They're able to understand the limitations of the analytic frameworks that they're engaged with. They're better at collaborating and finding individuals that can assist and be able to answer the questions that they want to answer. But fundamentally, and there's a question about marketability, I just think that as a student, learning at least the basic information about methods and taking as many courses as you can, seeking out additional trainings from, there's so many great trainings that are available from federal agencies, from professional organizations, at conferences, at pre-conferences, and so on, that lets you get more deeply into an area that you're interested in or that you think you're going to use more often. But when you're starting out or you're in school, I think you should take a complementary approach and take as many methods courses, methods focused courses as you can.
I think I would second that absolutely. The more courses you can take, the better it is. I mean, you have, and I think of that as a toolkit, and the more tools you have in your toolkit, the better it is. So you can really address questions, and you have the questions that drive the methodology, not the other way around. And so I think that is truly important. And more recently, I think, and I want in EdPsych, for example, we have started emphasizing mixed methods. And I think there is a lot to qualitative methods that, and there's a lot of rigor, lots of different ways of doing qualitative methods. And we should, so when I say research toolkit, it's both qualitative and quantitative. And what sort of qualitative method do I want to use? What sort of, or those depend on, again, on your research question. So I think both, we need both, and a solid research design course, I think, is really essential for graduate students. And that really helps, having a good research design course and a lot of tools in your research toolkit.
My mentor and my advisor, Paul Schutz, many of you may know him. He told me to I want you to take a methods class every semester. I don't care if it's quant, qual, mix, I don't care what it is. But I want you to take a methods class every semester. And so I took a methods class every semester. So I took a lot of quant classes, a lot of qualitative classes, and I took mixed methods. And so, in retrospect, I think that was one of the best things ever. And then I got to the point, I kept wanting to take methods class. He was like, look, do you want to graduate? I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't want to graduate. And so, it got to the point, he had to eventually cut it off. But I think, he said, later on, you will pick up a book to learn content, but you won't pick up a book to learn methods, because it's not as easy to do that. He said, so while you're in graduate school, take advantage of all the methods classes that you can, and so that'll just be my advice to you. And don't be afraid to learn something new. Definitely, make sure, a lot of educational psychology programs are heavily quant. I do realize that, but, do try to take at least a qualitative methods class, even if you have to go outside of EdPsych to take it, which you probably will have to. Make sure you take at least a qualitative class. So even if you're not going to be a producer of qualitative methods, you can at least be a good consumer of qualitative methods. And a lot of schools now are offering mixed methods classes. Not everybody has one, but try to take a mixed methods class as well. I think that'll be really important for you to take. So take as many as you can, so you can at least have all those tools in your toolkit. So when it comes to you want to be the person later in your future life that you can do your own methods. You don't necessarily have to go and pay somebody else to do your methods. And, I see a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm gonna just get somebody else to do these methods. You want to be able to do your own methods. It doesn't mean sometimes you don't have to call in an expert, somebody who has a little bit more expertise, but you don't want to always have to rely on somebody else to do your methods. You can, do your methods yourself. So think about that as well.
Yeah, while you're in graduate school, please make use of the knowledge that's there. Take as many methods courses as you can. I took seven quantitative method courses in my doctoral program and still couldn't take one with Dr. Marchand, 2 that I wanted to take with her. So I had to learn those myself afterwards, and that's hard. YouTube's great, but it's not as good as the awesome professors. So take as many you can and take more qualitative. Take more qualitative. I only took one qualitative methods course, and I still regret it. So take more qualitative.
One more thing to add on to that, and that's I think sometimes as graduate students, you don't realize that the power that you have. If there's a handful of you, advocate go ask your department chair, ask your program, hey, we've seen this method coming forward. Why don't we have a mixed methods course? Where is this going? We actually consider that stuff when we're looking at hiring choices and things of that nature. So if the emerging scholars are typically the ones that are most plugged into sort of the emerging methods. And so sometimes they're not on the radar of your department chair. Or they don't think if they don't hear from their students that it's a desired course offering, then it's unlikely to get on the schedule. So, please make your advocate for yourselves, make your needs known. It's important.
Thank you. So methods courses are very important, noted. I guess the next question, we sort of touch upon this, but if there's anything that you wanted to add was, what core method coursework do you recommend to graduate students if they have the opportunity? And are there other resources out there for learning new techniques outside of formal coursework?
That last question, what are outside of the formal coursework? I think there's summer courses that are available. There are lots of them. They tend to be expensive, and it's so if you can get support from the department, for example, ISR, for example, the ICPSR, they have a whole lot of courses, and there's almost every kind of methodology or statistical method you can think of. There is something or the other that is available there. The other thing that I have done, even as faculty, because I felt I needed refresher courses, it wasn't that great, but I did take courses on statistics.com. I just went in there and took some courses that I'd already taken, so just so that to get back into it again.
I mean, there are a lot of methods institutes around the country, and I get emails all the time. They just kind of pop up, and then I just kind of pass them on to my students, like, oh, that looks pretty good, network analysis. Oh, you might want to take that. And sometimes, they're expensive, as Dr. Kumar said, but sometimes they'll be, like a reduced price or something. Every blue moon, they might even be free for students. And so I know the Odom Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, they have some expensive workshop, but then for students, they'll have like a reduced price, or sometimes students' prices will be free. AERA has been offering a lot of really good methods workshops, particularly, they've done stuff on a lot of qualitative workshop. I just got an email today for one for qualitative data analysis with Johnny Saldana, who's really good. It's like $40. That's like super cheap for qualitative analysis. And so, and I've been getting those all year. So, once you get on these listservs, you start seeing them all the time. And I think it's a matter of you just kind of taking advantage of those. Kieran and Bauer, the SEM. Yeah, I did that. They did that with R. Yeah, and so I'm still not sure how to work R. But yeah, so I've done SEM I learned SEM on Literal, but I've done workshops with Amos and R. So so there's different ways for you to learn different packages, software packages. And so, like Dr. Kumar said, we keep on trying to learn these different things and brushing up on different stuff. Like you said, they may not necessarily always be the best, but there are different things you can keep on doing. So they're out there, just kind of have to look for them. And then I think it would be really important, maybe for the motivation sake, that maybe you all can be a repository for these type of things. And as they kind of come by, maybe we can kind of pass them to you all, and then you can kind of maybe send it to a listserv. That might be a good way to kind of distribute them too. So students can kind of see, hey, this is kind of a place for us to look for different opportunities.
Listen to Quantitude. Listen to that podcast.
I don't really have much to add other than, sometimes I think research design is overlooked when people are looking for analyses and, the stats and this and that. And if you can find extra courses or resources that are specific to research design, I would spend some time on that too, because sometimes we skip that and it's super important. So, and that can be, I think the other part of that is conferences, I think are really good for getting exposed and thinking about some of the designs and also the associated methods and the analytic techniques that you might be interested in pursuing. Like, you don't know what you don't know. And then also, I'm sure when you've got visiting scholars that come to your universities and, they've got their lunch and learns or their little mini series, go to those, because I think sometimes, again, it's just that exposure that then might lead you to find those other places that you need to delve into. But, and then also funders, that may not be something on your radar right now as graduate students, but a lot of the big funding agencies, they'll often have like publications around research design, methodologies, and things of that nature, and also trainings specifically for graduate students, like stats institutes for using secondary data analysis and things of that nature, that sometimes you might just have to look a little bit.
I just wanted to add one thing. And we've been talking about methods and statistical methods, different techniques, but it's also important, I think, and that's where research design also comes in. But if you're doing quantitative methods, what do our measures look like? What is the quality of our measure? And I think that sometimes gets shortchanged. And so it is, if how you've operationalized a construct and how you're measuring it don't really go well together, then it is really, it ends up being garbage in, garbage out. You can use the most sophisticated statistical methods, but if your measures are not, if it is important when we can do our measures, there are so many, we have this item, we can do Roche analysis, and we can do even simple things like cognitive pre-testing. All those things are truly important before we actually develop our survey and go out there and say, these are the constructs we are looking at. So I think I just wanted to step back and add that, because that is a step that sometimes it's not taken as seriously as it should be taken. So
Thank you for sharing these wonderful resources. Before we move on to the next set of questions, I just want to give everyone a quick reminder to drop into the chat your questions that you may have for the panelists on trending methodologies and educational psychology, and we'll have an audience Q&A after the current discussion segment. So the next question that I have for you is, what methods do you feel our field could use more of, and why?
Mixed methods. I just went through a process of thinking that I knew what I was talking about, and an editor, Matt McCrudden, being very kind to me. And I read a lot of great works in that CP issue from 2019. I think Dr. Marchand was one of those authors. So she's really an expert. So mixed methods.
I'd say in addition to mixed methods, which I also happily agree with, thanks for the plug, Doug, is the more community-based methods. There's a lot of different models around how to engage it effectively with community-engaged research. And, we use there's a wide range of methods that we can use in community-engaged research, but there's also a kind of an art to understanding really what those partnerships mean and engaging in methods that authentically reflect the voices of our communities that we are working with for research. So I would like to see more methods that reflect that. And then also, in addition to mixed methods, I think more methods that are able to really unpack some of these complexities that we see around multi-level and emergent types of models. I think we have a tendency to everything. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And sometimes I review and I see a million SEM models and I'm not really sure why, and there's nothing wrong with those. They're great. I use them too, but I think they don't always match the questions that we're asking and the data that we have. So I think we could have more diversity of method that allows us to better characterize what we're interested in and get a more nuanced and well-rounded view of our phenomena.
I definitely support the mixed methods. I mean, you know, I'm a mixed methods person. I have a mixed methods book. So definitely see that, support that. But I would like to see us actually, you know, embrace qualitative methods more. You know, we, and you know, in theory we say, yeah, we support qualitative methods, but then when you look in our journals, you rarely see any qualitative methods published. I mean, you may see some mixed methods pieces published, but it won't be qualitative dominant mixed method studies. They're the quantitative dominant mixed method studies. And so I think we have a lot of room to grow in terms of qualitative methods. And there's just there's so many different approaches with qualitative methods, case study, there's narrative. I mean, there's just so much. So I'm not going to say we should do one this particular approach or this one. But I just think that we need to just be open, seriously open to what qualitative methods really could bring and, you know, to our field. You know, and it starts out with having more courses, you know, encouraging our students in our programs to take more qualitative methods, really valuing what qualitative methods could look like, and then have a concerted effort to actually, you know, put more qualitative methods in our extra journals. And I think that's what I actually would like to actually see.
I think I like the comment that Dr. Skinner has put in up there. I do think, yes, pattern-centered approaches, longitudinal, and in fact, sequential designs for our studies, all those things are important. So it's hard to pick and choose to say which method is more important and which is not. It depends. And in fact, when we talk about methods, there are so many new ways of studying things that are coming up that one can learn. For example, really looking at some neuroscience research, which has come in more recently, that can offer us some understandings in ways. I don't know how far that has gone, but I think that's something that's probably going to develop more over time. So it's every method has its place. We do need to learn all these different methods, however much we can. As I would say, I don't know that I would put one method above another. I think all of them have their place.
Thank you. So it seems like we have a couple of questions from the audience. The first question is, how do you account for race, ethnicity, and gender in your research design and analysis? Are there methodologies you combine with motivation theories / methods to account for these in your design?
Okay, maybe I'll go first this time. But I do think that particularly in motivation research, we are guilty of having looking at ethnicity and gender and so forth in terms of categorical variables. And so the most that you can say with that, there is a difference or there is not. And even more important than that, when we are trying to account for let's say for race or ethnicity, there are certain things that we may never capture if we were to look at it only from a quantitative perspective. For example, when we talk about competencies and when we talk about student competencies, what sort of competencies do they need? Our motivation research really focuses on academic competence. But then when I was interviewing students, when I was talking, these were some individual interviews that I was conducting with Black students, it was clear that those are not just the academic competency is dependent on other competencies, like competency for resilience, competence, for resistance, and all these things. That these I wouldn't have known if I had just used race as a categorical variable. So I think if we need to understand, and there might be certain motivational constructs that might be unique to groups, and just doing confirmatory factor analysis may tell us that these measures and the factors fit across groups, but we might be losing some construct, some concept that is unique and important to different groups that we may not capture through that. And so which is where I think all of us have been saying repeatedly mixed methods, I think, which is where we really need these qualitative methods and the mixed methods.
I put a resource in there. I think that directly kind of addresses the motivation field. This is a recent summary of a special issue that Alan Wigfield and Allison Cuenca worked on with some of the folks that are on the panel. Certainly needs to be more discussion and talk about this. I don't think we're quite doing it very well, or even thinking about it in the right way. So I do recommend section 4.1.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Dr. Kumar said, but I just want to add, I study race and racial issues as constructs directly. And so for me, in terms of accounting for, I study it head on. I don't look at it as necessarily just as a demographic variable. So I don't have to account for it. Because I just look at it directly. I look at race as an experience. And then I combine it with aspects of motivation, like how do African Americans experience whatever? How does racial identity impact, their academic achievement or, science achievement or whatever? So I'm looking at their experiences as being African American. So for me, race is central to whatever I study. So I just kind of really think the different ways that you can account for race and look at race. But I just think traditionally, and as psych, we didn't necessarily look at race and race-related constructs in that way. Other areas of psychology or just other areas of education mostly will look at race as a construct. We just didn't necessarily do that at psych. And so, that's one thing I wish we would actually do more of, actually focus more on race and cultural constructs within our work, and looking at how do they interact, how does it relate with motivation theories? Because so much of our motivation work is pretty acultural in terms of the experiences of people of color.
I think my fellow panelists said it really well. I think not as controlling for, put it that way, but also, I guess for me, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about and that I wish we would do a little bit more of in our methods is by not necessarily treating race and ethnicity and gender, which are the elements of the question, as individual variables that are held by an individual and only exist for an individual as a thing to study in terms of motivation. I think our motivation theories, and we need to understand that multi-level, multiply natured interactions. This gets back to that issue of context. So kind of thinking about the intersectionality of individuals and how our various identities come forward to influence our motivation, but also thinking about how the structures and systems that individuals are working within really are racialized and have gendered elements to them, and that influences how our own identities interact with those and are expressed within those contexts. And we don't think a lot about that. Ellen and Dr. Skinner and Dr. Kinderman just published an amazing paper very specifically around some of these multiple systems that interact to collectively influence the way we see our motivational phenomena expressed. And I think that we need to think more carefully in our research designs around how, and this is likely from a mixed methods, but also if we're engaged just quantitatively, capturing elements of those and those systems and using those in our analytic techniques is important to model those in instead of modeling them out if you're going to be taking a quantitative approach.
Thank you. I think Dr. DeCuir-Gunby, we have a follow-up question is, what methods do you use to center race in your research, and where can we learn these outside the classrooms, especially because they're not offered? And I'm not sure if you had something to add more. I think you replied.
Yeah, I was replying. I was just basically saying that part of it is the perspective I take. I focus on race, or everything that I do is question, and I'm talking about, so when I ask my research questions, it's centered on race. The participants that I focus on are African Americans, so it's very participant centered. I often use a critical race theory lens. So the questions research questions, the interview questions I use, the survey questions I use, everything, is centered around and guided by critical race theory, for instance. And then, of course, when I get my data and I analyze, then when I collect my data and I analyze my data and write up my data, so everything is focused and influenced by that theory. And so that's how race becomes very central to everything I do. And so that theory is very central to everything that I do. So in that way, methodologically, it guides everything. And so when the question is what methods do I use as center, it's more of my theory that I use, my framework that I'm using, my inquiry worldview is guiding in how I interpret and how I collect data and how I use all the methods and how I interpret all the methods and how I write everything up. And so it's not necessarily a particular methods, but it's the way I use the methods and the way I interpret the methods. But where can you learn these things? Well, you have to, it's about being exposed to a variety of theories as well. We talked a lot more about methods, the actual methods, but we didn't talk a lot about theories. And I think that is something that is missing. We need to focus a lot too on our training, our SI classes too. We need to expand the theories that our students get exposed to. That I didn't take a critical race theory class in graduate school. I did a lot of reading on my own. And then when I took my first job, when I took my job here at NC State, one of my colleagues just happened to be the student of Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of the major critical race theory researchers in education. And so, with her and through her, I actually began to get more connected to the critical race theory community because of my connections through her. And I just began to, to get more involved in that community. But, I think it's really important if you have I'm not saying you have to do critical race theory, but if you're interested in that, if there's a critical race theory class, you take that, or if there's a critical theory class, you take that, or whatever other interesting theories they might have, in your university, I think you should take it. So I think the thing is, they're probably not going to be in your ed psych department or program. You're going to have to go into social foundations or go into sociology or, some other field to take some of these theory classes. And it's these theory classes are really going to help you to think about your topics in a different way, think about your questions in a different way, think about methods, how to share. I mean, it's going to help you, it's going to turn your world around because you're going to be thinking about everything in a totally different way. And then that's going to help you to maybe center, for instance, if you're interested in race or gender or sexuality or whatever you might be interested in, it's going to help you center those things in a totally different way. So I think it's really important for you to take those theory classes alongside taking those methods classes, because theory and methods go hand in hand.
Thank you. I think we have one final question from the audience is, what methodological challenges do you experience in your research during the pandemic, and how do you address / plan to address those challenges?
So the pandemic was terrible for many of us for many reasons. And, you know, it hit our research group pretty hard in a variety of ways. You know, we lost some people to the pandemic, but we also lost the connection that we have to our classrooms with the teachers, and the teachers were just in disarray. So we adjusted to help them as much as we could. And what that meant was that we had to sacrifice data a bit. But we came together in a really good way to try to take what the teachers were telling us in the classroom to help them right away. And we were able to create some tools for them that they could use. And they didn't go through our normal rigorous testing process, although we're thinking about how those result now. So methodologically, what we did is we took the opportunity to learn new methods while we were developing these new tools and techniques. But because we weren't in the classroom with the teachers and weren't allowed to be, and they were having a lot of trouble, we took the opportunity to really do some different types of analyses, like social network analyses and discourse analyses, systemic functional linguistics. And it really kind of opened up our eyes and opened up the way that we looked at things and did things. So there was a bit of a silver lining. The best thing about it for our group, a silver lining, was that we came together as a team and we just were there for each other and helped each other more than anything else during this terrible time, because we really needed each other badly. So it's not exactly methodological, but it was really a challenge for all of us, for different reasons.
I would second that. We had just got a grant from NSF. It was a 5-year grant working with college students. And suddenly we went, you know, everything, all the learning activities, all the things that were planned and written could no longer be actually implemented because everything changed. And so it has been a challenge. It continues to be somewhat of a challenge. And we are 1.5 years into that project, but all the things that we had planned to do just shifted. Even the, you know, this was to do, we were looking specifically at low income academically talented students. That's what NSF calls it. But even the criteria for that changed. So whatever we had written did not work. So it has proved to be quite a challenge during these times. And it's not been easy on the students or the faculty. So, you know, like Dr. Lombardi said, you just had to go with the way things are and sort of bring it together, which is what we are trying to do now.
I agree with both Dr. Lombardi and Dr. Kumar, but we had a similar experience. I was working with middle school students and classrooms in the middle of a grant, NSF grant with my colleagues in Michigan and West Ed, and there's a few things that are very practical that happened. And then, so, missing data. So there were things like testing that didn't happen. Assessments were different. I mean, so we adjusted in a variety of different ways, including trying to bookend more with more dense data collection. So you have to respect the challenges that classrooms are facing. And so the natural inclination is like, well, let's collect more when they come back. Let's do this. And that's not necessarily going to be the best thing for teachers and students. So, we adjusted by thinking about maybe having more longitudinal data collection and try to understand, you've all heard about the threats of history, right? You just experienced one. So even when we have this data, I don't know, we have to think differently about what we can learn from it, right? In terms of our motivation theories, like what patterns can we understand? What types of qualitative data should we be collecting to really elucidate the experiences of our partners and our students that we're working with? And then, I think, sorry, I wrote some notes down. I can't read my own handwriting, but I think just also we had to pivot to both be responsive, reflective partners, and also at the same time think very carefully about how we can interpret and make meaning of the data that we do have in a way that what does that tell us about our motivation constructs and theories when the classroom is different, and how is it different, where is it different, and why is it different, and do our methods and data allow us to address those questions in a meaningful way? Because we don't want to put out findings and results and draw conclusions about things that may not be appropriate given the history that we just experienced.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I think we're running out of time. So I'll just share my screen real quick and do a quick plug for our motivation SIG. So this wraps up our spring 2020 Motivation Monday panels. So I just want to let you know, stay tuned for the Motivation SIG events for the summer and fall. As we close, I just want to thank our panelists for the insightful and enriching conversations. And thank you everyone who joined us, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.